Nataliya Bugayova is a fellow at the Washington-based Institute for War and an expert on Ukraine. Nataliya, you've just got back from a trip with General David Petraeus to Kyiv. What's the mood there?
Thank you, Andrew, and it's great to be here. I'll highlight two things. First, I think there is a sense of strategic clarity on the ground that it is a persistent fight. It's a long fight despite the ebbs and flows on a battlefield. And frankly, Russia helps maintain that strategic clarity with its daily attacks on Ukrainian cities, including when we were in Kiev, on Ukrainian forces, on critical infrastructure, with continuous reports of atrocities on the occupied territories and so on. So there is no confusion that Russia's intent, even 2.5 years into the war, remains the same, to fully subjugate Ukraine. Um, I would say that second, as a result of this, you see a massive growth of domestic defense technology capability. And back in 2022, we've seen a lot of innovation on the ground and MacGyvering to adapt existing capabilities and technologies and use them in creative ways. But what's emerging now in Ukraine is massive and impressive defense industrial capability, including an impressive engineering cadre that is also directly tied to the battlefield needs and has a rapid innovation and iteration cycle. And that really stood out to me during this trip is emergence of this asset, if you will, of agile Ukrainian defense industrial base that I think also has a lot of implications and lessons learned for the West.
And we're 2.5 years into the war now. Where are we strategically and in every other way?
Yeah, I think while it may feel like a new normal or the war has stale to some in the West, when you're in Kiev, you realize that is an illusion. The fundamentals of this war remain the same. As we discussed, Russia still seeks full subjugation of Ukraine. There's still no indication, in my assessment, that the Kremlin seeks any off ramps or resolution of the conflict on terms that do not result in eradication of Ukraine's sovereignty. There are thousands of artillery shells fired on the front line a day. Both sides are racing to develop these new technological capabilities, and speed of innovation cycle is much faster than I believe anywhere in the Western world. Russia's objectives regarding NATO, US, UK haven't changed either. Russia remains a self-identified adversary, and the war is also reinforcing the worldview that believes in the expansion by force. So I would sum up at the strategic level that there is no going back to the status quo, no matter how much some of the Western leaders would prefer that. Um, and the real choice that we're really facing is either to invest in countering the Russian challenge in Ukraine and against the West in the way that results in a durable peace, or settle for a temporary respite that will have us facing the same problem with much higher escalation risk and cost down the road. Um, at the operational level, it's early to assess, but I think Ukraine has a chance to hold Pokrovsk. If we look at the Pokrovsk axis, and even if Russia is able to take the city, which the Russian forces are pursuing at enormous costs, it would likely result in Russian culmination and potentially provide opportunities for Ukraine to attack. I think the winter is going to be hard. Everyone recognizes it because of Russian missile campaign that will be aimed at devastating Ukraine's energy grid. But Ukraine is taking steps to prepare for that. But I think that's an area where additional Western support, specifically the air defense capabilities, is vital at this point.
Zelensky's taking what he calls a victory plan to the United Nations, to Biden in particular. Can Ukraine win? What's Ukraine's advantage at the moment?
I would frame it in two ways. I think first, part of Ukraine's advantage is actually in Russia's weaknesses that we often overlook, and in part in the West help offset. with some of our incrementalist policies. So first of all, Russia is not invulnerable, and while it certainly has uh, several key advantages that are well discussed, it has several vulnerabilities as well. First and foremost, its inability to rapidly pivot, even though with time it always is able to adjust. Russia is also accumulating, and Putin himself is accumulating a number of a number of fronts, including domestic stability and the economy, and the fundamentals of the Russian defense industrial base. But Russia also depends on a number of hard to replace capabilities that Ukraine is currently targeting. And if pressure on Russia persists, now that does require persistent support from the West. But if that persists, Russia will be facing a lot of accumulating challenges in let's say next year, because it's not able to replace some of these assets as fast as it's burning them, including in its very costly offensive in Kursk. So I think that's number one. And the second I would highlight is
So
that
they're losing 1,200 men a day killed and wounded, and they're not replacing them that quickly. Is that what you're saying as one of the great, the Russians I'm talking about, says that's Ukraine's big advantage?
um, I would say it's more relates to Russia's um, material, not just manpower, because Russia's defense industrial base and its weapon system is the rate determining step for Russia in this war, not necessarily the manpower, even though the manpower, of course, is a key factor as well. And Russia eroding, the Kremlin is eroding a lot of Russia's future capabilities, and Russia's defense industrial base ability to consistently support the current tempo or to fully resource Russia's reserve manpower is far from given. The current Russian policy are eroding the foundations of defense production, including macroeconomic stability in Russia and the workforce. And I think I will end to say that while Russia has deployed a lot of its capability, and yes, it's surging and it's succeeding in part to produce or maintain more, the West hasn't really surged a lot of its latent capability to support Ukraine. So we still have that option. And Ukraine's defense industrial base, of course, is increasing its capacity as well.
How important is it that Storm Shadow missiles and other missiles from the West can be used in Russia? It's a huge debate, obviously, between London and Washington and Berlin at the moment.
Look, I think Russia has to be denied its safe space to launch attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure and military assets without Ukraine having any ability to strike back. It is fairly straightforward. Uh, I think the delays and incrementalism in expanding some of these authorities are eroding Ukraine's and Western advantage because it provides Russia time to adapt and move some of the assets beyond the range of some of this long range weapon systems. That said, there are plenty of um, valuable targets within the range that is being currently discussed. So I would say it's incredibly important to be able for Ukraine to be able to use some of these long range weapon systems, including Storm Shadow, on Russian territory. I think, secondly, the risk of escalation is exaggerated, especially when compared to the cost of letting Ukraine fail. We've consistently seen Putin, first of all, the West has crossed numerous Russian red lines. We've also seen that Putin actually remains a pretty risk-averse actor. If you look back in 2022, he invaded Ukraine at the moment when he expected minimal resistance. Um, and when his original plan to conquer Ukraine in 3 days failed, he actually took many months before he tried to patch the capability gap through mobilization. He's been quite cautious in how he's pursuing response in Kursk to Ukraine's offensive in Kursk, and it took Russia a few days to even acknowledge that properly and start a counter-terrorism operation in that territory. So I would just highlight that we observe Putin remaining at quite a risk-averse actor despite a lot of rhetoric. And then finally, I think the risk of course, the nuclear escalation is there and it's inherent, frankly, in any attempt to resist aggression of any nuclear armed state. And it will be present if and when Putin invades Ukraine again, if Russia is allowed to freeze the lines. So unless we decide that we subordinate our foreign policy to any other nuclear power, then the best course of action remains to help Ukraine continue liberating its territories and its people as the only path to an actual durable peace rather than a temporary respite. I will add one more point on the storm shadow. I think there's also there's a huge focus on specific systems, and the West has been really impaling itself on specific weapon systems as game changers in the war. I think UK has set a really important precedent as a first mover in provision of some of these key systems that rallied other Western support, and that has been critical. But no single system is going to be the game changer in the war. It's a combination of different systems that support different effects that will matter. So I think priority right now is actually investing in helping Ukraine's defense industrial base to surge, as well as revamping Western defense industrial base to increase the overall stocks and availability of some of these capabilities.
Of course, that would be helped enormously if the West were to unfreeze the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets held in Euroclear in Brussels and elsewhere. Especially if that could be done before President Trump, the chance of President Trump becoming president again. Where are we on all of that?
I believe that some of the interest from Russian frozen assets is being currently used to support Ukraine. However, I agree that it would be helpful if the broader Russian policy, counter-Russia policy or policy to support Ukraine would be coherent in the sense of incorporating both military and economic levers of power more effectively. This going back to the question of Russian vulnerabilities and Western policy of incrementalism that is providing Russia with these pockets and time and space to adapt because we're rolling out, be it military support or economic measures or countermeasures in this incremental fashion. So we're helping Russia essentially absorb more shock and absorb more cost with accumulating less risk than they would have otherwise.
What's you're an expert criminologist. What's Putin's strategy?
I think the core Russia strategy right now and the main effort after Putin failed in his 3-day invasion plan in 2022 is to direct all the energy in shaping Western decision making. And that process includes both information operations, but also physical activities that support informational effects. Right. And I think that there are a number of lines of effort there, including helping convince not just the US, but less broadly that supporting Ukraine is too costly, it's too risky, it's not in our interest. That support doesn't really make a difference. That to help us to try to prevent us from developing a coherent long-term strategy, because actually Western persistence can be lethal to Russia's objectives in Ukraine, simply because Putin realizes that as long as Ukraine's will to fight persists, combined with Western support, Russia is not able to accomplish its objectives militarily in Ukraine. So Putin's strategy is to redirect a lot of his energy and the Kremlin's energy in trying to shape our perceptions. I think we can also discuss some of the Russian tactics that are focused on simply confusing the debate and forcing us to argue about irrelevancies in this war instead of actually focusing on solution.
So,
A great,
such as what? What examples would you give for irrelevancies?
yeah, I think a great example of that, and I will name two. Like the first one is discussing um, the resolution in Ukraine in the context of giving certain territories to Russia that have Russian-speaking Ukrainians um, on those territories, which actually a myth created by Kremlin, and a myth created by Kremlin, as we've seen that Russia actually targeted a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. It invaded territories in Ukraine that were populated by Russian-speaking Ukraine, destroyed a lot of economic wealth and well-being of those Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So that is to say that Russian objectives in Ukraine have never been protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and yet the debate still often brings that fact up. In the context of discussing of how the war would end. I think another example is Putin kind of forcing us to discuss whether Ukraine as a country has a right to exist, and his detours into historical uh, discussions of history of Kiev and Rus, which is irrelevant to the current point, because the world avoids a Hobbesian war of all against all by rejecting the validity of such arguments, and yet Kremlin is really focused on driving them as it tries to divert our discussions about what to do now into these historical irrelevancies, if you will.
You've seen that people around Trump, especially the isolationists around Trump, are trying to present this as another forever war. Um, and they're asking, why should we really care about the war? What's at stake for the US and to a lesser extent the UK? What do we say to counter that?
I think a couple of points. First of all, there's a category error in the discussion of this being a lone war. It cannot be a lone war for the United States or the UK because US or UK or other countries are not fighting that war. They're helping Ukraine fight that war. But I think it's really important to call out this category arrow in the discussion. In terms of the stakes, I think US and the United Kingdom and European countries have a lot more at stake than they realize in this war, because the cost of failure, meaning letting Russia prevail in Ukraine or freeze the gain, is much higher than the cost of continuing to support Ukraine. Again, as long as Ukraine's will to fight persists, because in the scenario where Russia wins and or manages to freeze the gains, it will take time to reconstitute, to rebuild its large-scale warfighting capability, to focus on eroding the center of gravity on this war, Ukraine's will to fight and Western support. And when Russia is ready, because of its unchanged intent, it will launch new attacks on Ukraine, and we will be faced with the same problem, with the same or worse escalation risks, but under conditions that favor Russia. I think the second thing I'll mention is that it's not only about Russian capability that disproportionately depends on the outcome of this war. It is also about Russia's intent, and not only intent regarding Ukraine. It is also about Russia's intent regarding the United States, UK, NATO, because Russia keeping these gains will literally reinforce the problem that got us here in the first place, and that being the Kremlin's worldview that believes in the expansion by force, and that taken an increasingly anti-US, anti-UK stance. And Russia's victory in Ukraine essentially would present the West with a not just reconstituted, but embolden Russia that is more determined to undermine the United States. As you've seen, this war is transforming Russia within fundamentally. There is an emergence and expansion of ultranationalist ideology that is inherently anti-Western, and allowing Russia to prevail would mean that that ideology will be solidified and will shape Russia's foreign policy for decades to come. I think the final point I'll mention about the stakes, it is also fundamentally about the effectiveness and credibility and the cost of US and NATO's deterrence. Our alliances and partnerships are fundamental to US deterrence and UK's deterrence, in no small part because we rely on access and placement that they provide. And our security also depends on our adversaries' latent and existing intent to not make a repeated decision not to attack us or hurt our interests. And if Russia is able to prevail in Ukraine, especially because of reduction of Western support, that perception of credibility and deterrence will diminish, and the cost of that will grow. So I think that's another very important element of what's actually at stake here.
Is a negotiated settlement even possible?
I would answer briefly that, first of all, that presumes that Russia actually has an intent or an objective to settle. So far, we're seeing no indication of that whatsoever. I think, secondly, the purpose of any negotiated settlement is to ensure that the conflict is settled. Right now, there are very little objective reality that would support, if the lines are frozen today, this becoming a durable peace rather than a temporary respite, in part because Ukraine still needs to liberate some of the critical terrain that's vital, not just from military standpoint, but also from economic standpoint, including in the south. And similarly, right now, Putin believes, in my assessment, that he can outlast the West, in part because of our policy of incrementalism. So there's little indication that he would use any settlement for anything other than preparation for the resumption of offensive operations in Ukraine, but also for reconstitution of Russian capability to be used in other areas to complete some of Russia's longstanding objectives, for example, in Belarus, Moldova, that Russia has been pursuing for a while and still intends to achieve.
How's the war transforming Russia? What does it mean for Russia's relationships in the world?
I think, as we briefly discussed, the war has really empowered an ultranationalist ideology inside of Russia that Putin relies on to both sustain his regime and sustain this war. There is a lot of discussion of who's after Putin. I would say that if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, the next after Putin may or may not be like Putin. But if Russia prevails in Ukraine, this ultranationalist ideology will be solidified, and the next after Putin will almost certainly be like Putin or worse because of political imperatives that this empowered ultranationalist community will generate. And that will have absolutely implication for Russia's relationships with the West long term, because that's the cadre that will be shaping Russia's foreign policy for many years to come.
Is there a risk of Russia collapsing?
I would answer it with two thoughts. First of all, Russia has been an unstable matter for a long time, but it can exist in this condition for a long time as well. Putin has been accumulating a lot of risk internally. There are rising ethnic tensions, in part driven by the war and again by empowered ultranationalist class inside of Russia. There are tensions within civilians and returning military in Russia. There are also economic clashes that are being exacerbated by the war. So there are numerous fragilities and conflicting structures that Putin regime has been accumulating and exacerbating. Now, what I would say though, and that has to do a lot with the Western discussion about fear of Russian collapse. Um, Russia may or may not collapse, but if it does, it will not be because of something that West has done, rather of 30 years of policy that we just discussed that have eroded every capability and foundation of Russia's economy, society, population, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a little bit both of arrogance and naivete in Western discourse, thinking that there would be something that we can do or will do that will trigger that, and not, again, the 3 decades of destructionist policies that Russian leadership pursued internally, including launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine that resulted in over 500,000 casualties inside of Russia and every imaginable negative consequences for the Russian economy.
How worried are you? And actually, more importantly, how worried are Ukrainians, the sort of people you met in Kyiv, that a future President Trump is going to just switch off the spigots and no longer give any support, military support to Ukraine?
Look, U.S. support has been game changing, and it is a center of gravity in this war. And I think there is a realization of that in Ukraine and as well as in Russia, of course. And that's why Putin is spending so much time trying to erode that. That said, there's an increasing focus on self reliance in Ukraine. And that's why I started with the reflection about the defense industrial base capability and expansion of Ukraine's ability to be self-reliant in the long term. So I think there is a realization that it is a long fight. There is a realization of the need to persist. And while there is a natural worry, of course, about potential of diminishing aid, there's also realization that Ukraine will be investing in its own capabilities to persist in this fight.
When you and I were in Kyiv last year, we met Alexandra Kamyshin, the Minister for Strategic Industries. Very impressive figure, I think we both felt. Tell us a bit about the internal ministerial setup in Zelensky's government.
What I would say, without going into nuances of Ukrainian politics, is that the Ukraine's defense industrial sector has many impressive figures, such as Alexander Commission, but also a lot of emerging talent, both in the state-owned enterprises as well as private industry that are focused on domestic production. It is notable and noticeable how much that cadre has evolved and is growing, and I think it will be a key foundation for Ukraine's efforts to increase its self-sufficiency in terms of military capability for years to come.
What are the key decision points and choices that need to be made in the next year regarding Ukraine? Not just for Ukraine, but Russia, the UK, the West in general. What are the key moments that we should be looking out for over the next year?
I would start with Russia. I think Putin will have a decision point regarding Kursk because part of Russian Federation is occupied, and no matter how much Kremlin is trying to downplay the significance of that, no matter how much Kremlin is trying to isolate Russians in the information space from the reality of Kursk, the reality remains the same. Part of Russian Federation is occupied, and that's not a decision that Putin can ignore. That's a decision point for him to make of how and what way to retake that territory. I think the second one is regarding the manpower, and whether the current recruitment pace is sufficient to fulfill Russia's objective, which I think in assessment of many is not, and whether he will need to actually call mobilization. Regardless of the decision that he will make, it will not be without cost, and it will open additional opportunities for Ukraine and the partners. I think for the main decision for partners, for Ukraine partners, Western partners in particular, is to really it's a strategic decision, right? It's a decision between helping address the drivers for this war, and in doing so, potentially securing a generational win, or passing the national security risk forward. That's the real choice I think we're facing. It's between a lasting investment and a lasting solution that may take longer, or trying to settle for some short-term solution that nevertheless will be guaranteed to be costly and potentially catastrophic for Ukraine and its partners in the future. So that's the real decision and choice that I think UK, United States, the West faces.
Nataliya, thank you very much indeed. Tell me what book, history book or biography are you reading at the moment?
Great question. I am actually reading a book by a Ukrainian journalist and now a member of Ukrainian armed forces. His name is Pavlo Kazarin, and the book is called The Wild West of Eastern Europe. It's actually his chronology of history of modern Ukraine. It was born out of the occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the war, and the author is from Crimea. And I think it's a really good account of what this war is really about, what is at stake in this war, what forces are actually fighting in this war. One of his quotes, I think, from the book that says, "We're trying to understand where they, meaning Russia, ends and where we, meaning Ukrainians, start," sort of captures the essence. I think it's also a great account of Russian efforts to create alternative reality in Russia, in Crimea, in Eastern Ukraine back in 2014, but also in the West. So would highly recommend for anyone following this issue.
Nataliya Bugayova, thank you very much indeed for appearing on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you very much for having me, Andrew.
Thank you, Nataliya. On the next Secrets of Statecraft, I'll be speaking to Sybil Browder, the author of Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice, and Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.